Hello, everyone, and welcome to Upstream and API Sec's webinar, Turbocharging API Security to Combat Car Hacking. We've got Dan Barahona, founder of API Sec U with us, and Yanov Maimon, VP of Cyber Services at Upstream Security, who spearheads the Vehicle Security Operations Center. It's going to be a great session, so let's get started. By the way, we will have time for a brief Q&A at the end of today's session, so if you would like to put forward a question, you can do so by typing it into the Q&A box on your screen. If you're unfamiliar with the Teams UI, that is the two speech bubbles up there at the top. A recording of the event will also be made available afterwards. But without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dan and Yanov. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depends on where you are in the world. I'm Yaniv Maimon. I'm the VP of Cyber Services at Upstream. I lead our VSOC, which is the Vehicle Security Operations Center service, and also Auto Threat, Cyber Threat Intelligence Service at Upstream. And as mentioned today, I'll be joined by Dan Barahona from EpiSec. Good morning, Dan.
Yeah, good morning. It's sun's not even up here in San Francisco yet, and probably late in the day where you are. But thanks for having me. I'm really excited for today's session on combating API threats for connected cars and fleets and everything else. I'm the founder, one of the co-founders of APISec University, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in coming slides, but also head of growth for APISec, which is API security testing technology. So really excited to be part of the conversation here today.
Likewise, and today we'll discuss the areas sort of where API security and automotive cybersecurity intersect. And I guess being cognizant that we have in the audience here, people from multiple disciplines. So not just API and automotive, and I guess just enthusiasts in general. We'll try to cover some of the basics first, going over some of the challenges that we see in this field, some of the threats that we see. We'll provide some real-world examples of attacks that we're seeing and sort of a glance behind the scenes of how we're able to detect and defend from such attacks, and also to share our view of best practices. So that's pretty much what we're going to cover today. But first, Dan, I believe you have some exciting news to share with us.
Yeah, I sure do. So a little bit of background on APISec University, if you're not familiar. It's a site we launched about a year and a half ago, really addressing what we felt like was a gap in the market on API security awareness and training and education. And we really tapped into something special there. There really is a vast need to improve our sort of API security expertise. And so we launched APISec University with my friend Corey Ball, the author of Hacking APIs. And the courses really took off. We've got a pen testing course there. We've got an API security fundamentals course, which is really great introduction to the topics of API security. We have a course on the OWASP top 10 and API documentation and PCI compliance, and continuing in the vein of more and more sort of targeted and vertical specific content. Super pleased to announce that today we've launched a new course called API Security for Connected Cars and Fleets. And very pleased that we were able to partner with Upstream, your company and your colleagues who have really remarkable expertise in this space. All our courses are free and offer certificates and badges, which you can proudly place on your LinkedIn profile or elsewhere. There's a QR code, or you can just go to apisecuniversity.com and you'll find it there right on the homepage. But that course has gone live about, 12 hours ago, and we're already north of 500 students enrolled. So congratulations to Upstream for putting together a really nice course here, and I'm very excited to offer it to the community.
Very nice. I'd like to hear it. Okay.
So I think the best way to kick things off is to kind of set the stage for why this is such an important topic. So if you don't mind, going to the next slide here. This is sort of my go-to intro slide, right? And there's really three things that are driving why this is such a critical topic. And the first is the API explosion, right? So APIs are just eating the internet. It used to be software eating the internet. Now it's APIs. It's powering everything from when we request an Uber or book a flight or send a message, transact something, or even unlock our car doors, right? That's all being powered by APIs, and this is actually quite an old stat. I'd be curious what it is now, but according to Akamai, 83% of the internet traffic is API traffic, right? So machines talking to machines. So that's great. It's enabled entire new industries to form. But attackers have also taken notice and have discovered that these are really ripe targets for attacks. And for quite some time, Gartner has predicted that APIs would become the most frequent attack vector. That prediction came out a few years ago, and it was said that by 2022, last year, that would be the case. It's certainly, if not the most frequent, it's probably the most effective or the most successful attack vector. And we've seen just countless examples of pretty significant breaches that result in, not hundreds or thousands of records, but hundreds or millions of records, really, hundreds of millions. So they're under attack, right? And we're frankly just not doing a really great job of defending these APIs in general. And that's, I think, why AppSec University has done so well, and why firms like Upstream have emerged to address this issue. And API attacks are just fundamentally different. So our sort of classic ways, our legacy technologies, our firewalls and scanners and the like just don't really find the flaws that exist in APIs that are being exploited. So we need to level up our game to improve the skill level, the technologies and the like. So that's why this is such an important topic. But I'd love to make this a little more specific to the automotive industry. So Yaniv, do you want to add any comments?
Sure, and maybe we can also talk a bit of some of the statistics and what we're seeing in that field. Looking into some of the trends and looking just at the last few years, and this is sort of statistics that we show in part of our research that we have for our annual report that we publish every year for the last few years. And you don't need to be a cybersecurity expert, I guess, to see the trend. And this is something that we've seen in the last few years, and this is still going strong. So 2023 isn't over yet, so we don't have the official statistics yet, but I can share that we're well over 1,400 incidents in total. So sort of showing the same trends. And as you can see, basically starting from 2017, the real significant increase that we saw, mostly due to the fact that we have more connected vehicles. And as we've seen sort of a recurring theme in many industries, and the automotive is not different, with greater connectivity comes greater vulnerability to some extent. And so the vehicles that were once sort of siloed from the internet are now interconnected, and we're seeing more and more threats. And of course, we'll share some more in the next few minutes. But also sort of to zoom in, and anyone wants to guess how do they get connected? Through APIs. And of course, just in the last year, so not in the span of a few years, so just in the last year, we saw an increase of almost 400% in the number of attacks in the automotive space that are targeting APIs. And I guess then I don't know about other industries, but I guess this is quite alarming to some extent.
It's remarkable. It's probably true across the board, but what's really been incredible is some of the high-profile breaches that have taken place. We've seen them pretty much across the board in fintech and in healthcare and in many others. We'll talk about those in detail here, but really incredible. And I guess the attacks, are not only sort of paralleling the growth of APIs, but frankly outpacing it, right? So we're seeing increased focus and targeting of APIs specifically by attackers.
Absolutely, and maybe to zoom in on some specific examples, right, and sort of the shift that we see, and looking at the span, sort of a broader span, what we call the automotive threats 2.0, of the fast and furious type of threats that we see. So if you look back, with 2015, with some of the first maybe high-profile automotive cybersecurity incidents, where you had to invest years or months even in research. You have to be a real domain expert into understanding how the internals of the vehicle works. You need to act an actual vehicle also to make use of it. But this is, as you can see, changed dramatically now with the vehicles being connected, and some of the connectivity basically allows basically uses public-facing APIs, we're seeing a very, very different type of effort from attackers. So instead of being an automotive cybersecurity expert, it's enough to know a lot about APIs in order to affect millions of vehicles. And maybe something that is a bit different from the automotive industry in general is also the potential impact. So it's not just stealing a record; it's something that can actually impact the safety of people, right? The vehicle themselves. And this is definitely something that is of concern. And this is why we also see in this industry regulations. So the regulators did see these alarming trends and the potential impact. And now with over 50 countries across the world, there are actually regulations that mandate that every new connected vehicle has to be monitored for cybersecurity threats, which again, I guess is kind of different from other industries.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what's interesting here, your very first one, right? The level of effort to do it. In cybersecurity, there's something known as the kill chain, which is, all the steps that, an attacker needs to go through in order to execute some sort of a breach. And historically, the kill chain was, a fairly complex thing, right? It was multi-steps. You had to do reconnaissance, and then you had to weaponize, you have to infiltrate. You have to somehow, gain access inside, then, escalate your privilege and pivot and find the data that you want to, get out, and then eventually, harvest and exfiltrate the data. Pretty sophisticated stuff, right? And you can see why it took years, months or years of effort to accomplish. But as you'll see, as we talk about some of these examples, API breaches are a whole lot different. If you can find a vulnerability in an API, you can go straight through to exploit. And APIs are they're wonderful things, but they're also a front door, and in many cases an open door to a lot of backend data, a lot of backend functionality. And I think that's why it's been such a target for attackers.
Yeah, I fully agree. And maybe before we go into some of the recent automotive incidents, maybe a more general one.
Yeah, this one is pretty eye-opening. So this is from Coinbase, and I'll just preface this: Coinbase did a phenomenal job of addressing this issue once it became known to them. But this is a great example of what we call logic flaws or logic-based attacks, right? So in this case, the researcher wanted to sort of poke around the Coinbase trading platform, and what did they do? They created an account, put a bit of money in, started trading. And like any good researcher, started watching the traffic between the front end and the back end, and saw that it was all being managed through API calls. And whenever he did a trade, you see here in yellow, there were 4 elements to the trade, right? What was he selling? In this case, Ethereum. Was he selling or buying? And then a source account and a destination account. And like a good hacker, next thing that he wanted to do was throw some kind of ridiculous requests in to get some error messages back. And a lot of times our apps return sensitive information or useful information in error messages. So in this case, he actually owned, as you can see sort of in the bottom there, 0.0243 units of Ethereum. All right, that was valid. He owned it outright. So when he did a trade through the API directly, he simply changed Ethereum to Bitcoin. And expected to get an error response back. But instead of getting an error response back, he got $43,000 deposited into his account. So he literally just morphed one asset into another asset. And the application went ahead and processed it. At that point, he knew he needed to notify Coinbase and did, and they reacted extremely quickly, reproduced it, shut down the market, fixed it, and within a day, we're back live. But they also then kind of blogged, you can find this on the Coinbase website, about what exactly happened, right? And the root cause of the bug was, quote, missing logic validation check. And what that means was the app was checking, did he own 0.0243 units? It wasn't checking of what. And so it could have put anything in there, I suppose, and it would have processed. So, that's a logic flaw, right? And that's an example of the app. I like to say, our development teams are under constant pressure to make the app do what it's meant to do. and it did. But in this case, it didn't not do what it wasn't supposed to do, which is allow you to change what you own. And so this is, I think, a very eye-opening example of the kinds of things that can get exploited in your APIs, right? You're not only exposing your legitimate use case, but any vulnerabilities or flaws that might exist in your application logic are also being exposed. And I think we see that not just here. There are many, many, many examples, and certainly not to pick on Coinbase. I think they did a fine job of responding to this, but it just shows how sophisticated or how difficult it can be to find these types of flaws in your own applications. And Yaniv,
yeah,
please bring this home to more of an automotive world.
Absolutely, and maybe to share some a couple of high-profile incidents, I guess, from the last year. This is I think a pretty well-known research done by Sam Curry and a team of researchers, basically being able to remotely connect and to some level even control vehicles from multiple brands that you can see here on screen. Again, this was all made public, Honda, Nissan, Infiniti, etc. Just by exploiting sort of a vulnerability in the APIs, and this is maybe something that is even important to highlight in the automotive world, where there are a lot of supply chain providers. So in this case, they didn't even hack directly the OEMs or the car makers, but basically making use of the interface with one of the providers, or a telematics provider, so SiriusXM in this case, and basically allowing, without having proper authentication in place, to address certain vehicles, or basically inputting a VIN, which is the vehicle identification number, which is the unique identifier of the vehicle, basically allowing some level of control as it's possible from the app. So to unlock the doors, to remote start the engine, or even to view the location of the vehicle. So again, this is a sort of I think, pretty interesting example that we've seen, as you can see, affecting multiple brands. But that's sort of one type of incident that we saw. The other one affecting mobility service in Russia. So ride-hailing service Yandex. Basically, we saw attackers that were able to manipulate some of the requests and basically ordering or hailing multiple taxis to the same location, right? So again, I guess then pretty similar to what you discussed earlier, sort of a certain logic flaw, because we're all allowed to ride hail, right? This is sort of the reason this application exists. No one really looking if someone is ordering all these taxis to the exact same place. And this is, again, maybe to highlight one of the points that I made earlier. This has physical implications, right? Because this created a huge traffic jam in Moscow, basically hindering, the people's ability, creating a gridlock in downtown Moscow. So again, another example.
It's really, I mean, the breadth of the examples are pretty remarkable, right? So there's certainly, theft, right? Collecting PII and so forth. We see, many such examples, or it could be monetary, right? Theft of funds or sort of fraudulent transactions and things like that. But we see hacktivism, we see defacement, we see all kinds of different things being exploited through these APIs. There's actually a really remarkable video on Sam Curry's, I think it's on his Twitter account, where he has a friend on the other side of the country walk up to his car and it's locked, and then Sam unlocks it from his laptop. You see the lights flash and his car is now unlocked, right? And it's a really vivid demonstration of how APIs can get exploited if you know how to use them to lock and unlock cars and start and stop engines and all kinds of things.
Yep. And I think maybe, especially if you look back, I think also the car makers, right, again, in the automotive space, also wants to enable, right, vehicle owners also to have some kind of remote control. So just like a simple example that we saw of someone basically writing an home automation script using the APIs that the maker of his car provided him. Basically, his premise was, I live in a bad neighborhood, and sometimes I forget to lock the doors of my car, and people steal things from the car. So he wrote a home automation script to lock the doors every few minutes if the geolocation of the vehicle is near his house. But so it's cool that you can do that, right? But it also opens opportunities for attackers, for sure.
Well, and I guess one last thing to mention there is, it's not like these APIs are hidden and buried under the covers. They're powering our mobile apps. They're powering our web apps, and being able to sort of sniff that traffic or to watch that traffic is really not a sophisticated activity. So these aren't buried elements of our applications. They're quite visible, and if you know what you're doing, pretty easy to find and to attempt to exploit and manipulate.
Absolutely, and some car makers have developers portals, and obviously on GitHub you can find quite a lot of the code already made, and you just need to make use of it. Okay, so that's, again, we picked just two examples. There are actually a lot more, but as I mentioned earlier, I want to show some like behind the scenes view of how we detect and defend, basically allow our customers to detect and defend from these type of attacks. So maybe to show or to illustrate a real type of attack that we saw, which is not very different than what Sam Curry did in the research, but sort of showing an attacker that, again, exploiting an API vulnerability in the mobile app, or the companion app, as we call it, so the same a mobile app that people use to remote control the vehicle to some extent. And so we saw basically an attacker exploiting an API vulnerability to access vehicles that they were not authorized to use. So looking at how this looks from our platform, so the Upstream platform, the API security, so we can see sort of this type of attack that we're seeing a Ebola attack. But basically what we see in the data is sort of an enumeration of VINs. And again, a VIN is a vehicle identification number. So the same, what you have in the windshield of the vehicle, sort of the unique identifier that the manufacturer has for that kind of vehicle. So basically seeing that type of enumeration based on the APIs, we're able to spot that something is wrong, and what we call basically we're classifying different types of objects that we see, and this is sort of a type of VIN. So looking how this looks in the platform, sort of what we call the investigation view, we see the VIN, and this is, of course, just an example, not a real one, but we're seeing basically multiple VINs that are sequential, right? Because an attacker needs to know only one, and they can basically enumerate multiple VINs without having real access to any of those vehicles. And we're seeing multiple type of responses. So some have been successful and some unsuccessful. Again, like we're seeing some kind of, some types of brute force attack, or what we call a VIN spray attack. And in some cases, you can see we're seeing successful requests with 200 response codes, and basically indicating that this attacker was able to get or to pair with some of the vehicles and can execute remote commands, again, like unlock the doors or remote start the engine, and seeing the location of the vehicle. And again, we talked about Sam Curry. Also, I think a pretty well publicized incident was David Colombo basically getting access to Teslas around the world, also something that we saw. So that's sort of one way to look at it, sort of seeing one type of object being enumerated, which is we're not expecting to see in the data based on machine learning profiles, but maybe looking at it from a different perspective, because potentially an attacker can use multiple tactics, and we won't always foresee all the different tactics. In this case, we see sort of the digital twin, and with that we can see sort of the array. So using our digital twin, we can have a view, sort of the historical view of the different assets, in this case, vehicles or VINs that were correlated to a single account. So we can see, for example, for a specific user account, we had just one or two correlated vehicles. We now see over 50 different vehicles, and this allows us basically to look at this, to view this as an anomaly, or sort of an abnormal volume of pairing requests in the fleet. So we can take action, because obviously it's not enough to detect, and maybe it's something that we'll go into a bit more detail later, but also to respond. So once we detected that something is wrong, let's say with a user account that is potentially malicious, we also can take action to block that account, to unpair the vehicles, etc. So to make sure that there is no impact on the vehicle owners. Again, just a couple of examples of the things that we see sort of the day-to-day of working with car makers.
And even one thing that I didn't mention early on, my career started in the automotive world. I don't know if you knew this. I worked at General Motors. I was a safety and crash engineer. Right? So I designed airbags and things. And this is quite some time ago. And cars were largely mechanical devices. Right? I mean, even our keys were things you physically turned in cars to activate a starter and so forth. But looking at your demonstration there, cars are truly software on wheels these days, right? And if you think about the complexity of just like an e-commerce website, but then compare that to the complexity of a vehicle, and the fact that we're now turning all this vehicle functionality into API endpoints. The automotive industry has got to make that transition to becoming a software company. Like we see, in banking, companies that consider themselves software companies that do banking, or in retail, grocery companies that consider themselves tech companies. And some are making that transition faster than others. But you talked about like the Tesla incident. That took a long time to figure out, right? That was like one researcher spending a lot of time. But then you look at Sam Curry, and in a matter of months was able to hack into dozens of different car makers. So we definitely have work to do here.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right on that. And we actually call them data center on wheels. And I guess some of the trends that we're seeing are what we call software-defined vehicles. And some of the newer models, and in some cases we'll see in 2 or 3 years, are really that. So you will see, virtualization and things that we used to see in IT inside the vehicles, and obviously it create, more attack surfaces, and I'm sure that we'll be able to see some of that. We're actually able to see some of that already now. So again, I think we try to show just a few examples on how we see it. And obviously there are many challenges as how to protect, or defend from these type of threats. And there are no silver bullets. And we have to say the truth. And then maybe you want to cover some of the best practices sort of from your point of view, and maybe we can share also some from Upstream's point of view.
Yeah, mine are a bit more generic. So this will apply to pretty much any organization that develops, utilizes, publishes APIs. I won't go through every one of them. If you'd like to learn more, I highly recommend you check out our API Security Fundamentals course. We'll go into it. I'm a big believer that API security starts with governance. So a lot of times, security teams want to go right into, let's fix it, let's add something. But I really think you get a lot of benefit from stepping back and understanding, what's our API footprint look like? What are our APIs doing? What data are they accessing? How should we develop them? How should we deploy them? So I think, starting with governance is a really great place to start. Number 3 here, get security and development talking. There has historically been way too much separation between these organizations. I hear from security teams all the time, like, we don't even know what APIs we got. That may be true for your organization, but I bet if you go talk to the development team, they have a pretty good idea. Maybe not 100%, but a pretty good idea. And frankly, where are you going to fix these issues? You're probably going to need to fix logic flaws back in the code, right? So it's going to involve developers no matter what. API documentation should be non-negotiable. It should be mandatory. That's just we hear too much like, we don't document our APIs. Well, that's, go back and do that. That's critical. Train your API developers and owners, right? They need to understand this stuff and be aware of the risks and how to create more resilient APIs in the first place. Centralize your APIs. That's just good practice. Don't trust anything. That's all about input validation, right? So make sure what your API is receiving is what you're expecting, and if it's not, then throw it away, right? This is a classic way that APIs get manipulated. Authentication is not authorization. We see a lot of examples where companies, added authentication to an endpoint and thought they were done, not realizing that it's pretty easy to authenticate and then have access to the entire kind of user database. And we're big believers. Oh, sorry.
Dan, it's kind of like with encryption, right? So we have like a very robust mechanism, but if you don't use it properly, it's actually not worth a lot.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there are just a lot of examples. There's so much focus on authentication as there should be, but there needs to be just as much on authorization. Like, not only is Dan, but is Dan able to access Yaniv's records, right? That has just, and that needs to probably be enforced in the application itself, right? Not at a gateway or something like that. And we're big believers in pre-production testing, like you can pressure test your APIs on every release, not once or twice a year in a pen test, but on, make it automated, make it continuous. So those are general, my Dan's top 10 of best practices, but Yaniv, I know you've got some automotive specific ones here.
Absolutely, and maybe to share some of these, sort of on the backdrop on our VSOC in Ann Arbor in Michigan. This is our vehicle security operation there. I think some of the things that we put or help our customers to put the focus on, one is around being proactive, right? And I guess then us being sort of in the forefront to some extent, some of it seemed pretty basic, but I guess for some of the companies that are really looking at API security for the first time, it's important to really be proactive there. And like you said before, I guess some are not even aware of what they have in place. So starting with discovery and looking to shadow and zombie API is definitely where we see many of the threats. Even if in the connected vehicle world is not that old, like 5 or 6 years, I guess in some cases, still we see a lot of legacy, a lot of old interfaces still being available and obviously vulnerable. And also I think, like we said before, also putting a big focus on detection and mitigation. Again, many controls in place, but being able to detect something, and also in many cases, you have to build sort of dedicated response and mitigation tools, because in some cases they do not exist, right? So not just being able to understand, like we saw the example before, that something is abnormal in the user behavior, but also having the tools, and in many cases also to automate some of the response to make sure that if something is happening, you can stop it. And I guess also looking into additional capabilities, sort of looking at some of the threat landscape. Cyber threat intelligence is one of the things that we see from our customers that are interested in, again, to understand some of the threat actors in the space, and some that are targeting them, so malicious threat actors that are targeting them specifically, but also other types of vulnerabilities or other types of actors even that are not malicious in nature, but pose some kind of threat. And I mentioned, third-party applications that are sometimes being hacked to and basically affect the same, the vehicle owners, for example. So again, something that the car makers, at least in our case, need to be aware of, that some of the risks that their customers are facing. And also, lastly, the role of the VSOC in fighting API attacks. So you mentioned some of the silos sometimes we see between dev and sec, and think of that in a car maker point of view, you will have people developing the product, people developing the APIs, and obviously you can see that there are some challenges there. So we see the VSOC as sort of the function that combines or sort of the view of the threats, both to monitor, detect, and respond to them. And sort of provide this holistic view again for mostly for car makers. So that's I think some of the best practices, and this is to some extent API security is still a relatively new field, and so we're building more and more capabilities and best practices as we go, and also to adjust ourselves based on the type of threats and attacks that we see. And I think that's pretty much what we wanted to cover from the best practice point of view. And I know we've had, being aware of the time, I know we've had quite a few questions from the audience, and I think we have enough time to answer some of that. So
yeah, please do. And if you don't mind throwing up the last slide in case folks want to see the course again. I know there's some questions that are getting into like, EV charging, hacking, and things like that. That is covered in the course itself, so I highly recommend that you go check it out. We've released the first module of the course out of 4. It's going to be a total about a 2-hour course. And there's a lot of more detail in there. So we definitely talk about EV charging, hacking, and API abuse there as well. Yeah, I really appreciate any of you having me on the session here today, and it's been fun chatting with you.
Likewise, I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you, Dan. I think we are getting a few questions. So maybe we'll just run through a few of them. So we have a question: are all cars, make, and models susceptible to hacking? I'll take that, Dan, if you don't mind. I think.
Yeah, go for it.
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. Maybe to varying degrees, right? I guess, again, the same theme that we saw, the more connected the vehicle, so the attack surface will be broader, and so will be more susceptible to hacking. We are seeing, obviously, some car makers investing more in the security than others, but even the ones that invest the most, we're still seeing attacks, and some of which are successful. And so this is why we're trying to broaden the scope as much as possible to protect from API attacks, from in-vehicle type of attacks. You mentioned EV types of attacks, so definitely something that we're also looking into to protect from. So I think that was one of the questions. I see a second question: do vehicle APIs warrant their own top 10, or is it the OWASP API top 10 sufficient? What do you think, Dan?
I think the OWASP API top 10 applies very much to cars as to anyone using APIs. I think you've pointed out here on this call that there are some automotive specific challenges. Typically with most APIs or most organizations, you're authenticating a user to the API. In automotive land, you're often authenticating a vehicle, right? It's the vehicle that's getting authorized to functionality. And so, yeah, perhaps there ought to be maybe a special flavor of the OWASP top 10. But certainly that's what you're covering in the course on the website.
Absolutely, and I think even if not, I would say different type of top 10, but maybe the focus is a bit different. So again, I think a lot of focus on the logic, the business logic side of things, because car makers do test their APIs quite a lot, but I think it's really in the logic that we're seeing some of the attacks that are pretty difficult to defend from and to detect in general.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. How do you work on automating API testing for an organization? Any suggestions for vendors or tools?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that question. This is very near and dear to my heart. Yeah, I mean, API security testing is a real gap that exists in the market, and largely is satisfied through manual efforts, right? So pen testers and red teams and so forth. And our classic kind of web app scanner technologies don't do a whole lot for APIs. It's okay to find an injection vulnerability or things like that, but like that Coinbase example and many others, simply not going to get discovered. So that's actually what my company, AppySec, so there's AppySec University, but there's also AppySec.ai. It's a company I work for. We have a technology that does that. In fact, there's a scanner on the website that you can try it out yourself on your own APIs and get some preliminary results. So I would just say that there are technologies out there now that actually do a good job of understanding your specific API logic, crafting really broad set of test coverage, and then running that in a continuous fashion so that every release, every drop gets tested. And if that's of interest to you, I definitely recommend you check out appysec.ai and give us a shout. So appreciate that question.
Excellent. Okay, I think I don't see any other questions. I know from the Mobix team if there are anything else for us to address.
I do see one here. One. There's a few in the Q&A, but I would just say there's one on note. There are many valid use cases for VIN enumeration, right? For fleet owners, dealers. How do you distinguish between valid and non-valid? I'll take a crack at that. Maybe Yaniv, you can wrap it up here with your own thoughts. But I would just say, sometimes you need a sequential ID, right? There's a valid use case, valid justification. If you don't, then don't, because sequential IDs or incremental IDs, it's just making it easier for attackers to harvest, right, and to sort of iterate through your database. So I would just say a better practice is not to have incremental, unless there's a valid reason why it's necessary. But I don't know, Yaniv, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, sort of the day job that we do here. There are some real cases, again, dealers. So let's say you're a new salesperson at a large dealership. This is your first day on the job, and you want to be able to pair with all the vehicles in the showroom, right? So you can see the functionality, the potential buyers. So there are legitimate use cases, but once you understand them, you see that there is a sort of a limit of let's say a human can do in a certain time frame that something that is automated cannot. And sort of identifying that and trying to differentiate between human and machine behavior is something critical, and this is something that we actually do. There are also other types of data points you can use. So for example, the identity, the location of the vehicles, etc., to make sure that you have no false positive in detecting that. And of course, it's all sort of a risk-based approach, or you can also set different thresholds. So if it's 20 vehicles in a minute, that's one thing. But if it's 10,000 vehicles in a second, that's a completely different story, right? And definitely something worth noting is sort of how to differentiate between this type of behaviors. Again, this goes to, I guess, boils down to business logic to some extent, right?
That's
that
right.
You need to be aware of on the business flows to see what can be real and what can be potentially malicious.
Totally agree.
Hi there, folks. Stuart, moderator here. I'm just wondering, are we going to be wrapping up the webinar, or are you interested in doing more questions? Typically, I do handle the questions. You've been handling them well so far, but typically I would be the one to do that, essentially. Do you want me to jump in and take over and we can take it from there, or are you happy just for us to wrap up now?
I think we have time for one more question. If that's okay, Dan, because I do see now the Q&A box, and I think maybe last question is, are driverless cars more vulnerable? Like someone gave the example of a Tesla than other vehicles. For me, at least, the answer would be to some extent yes, because that means that some of the functionality that do not exist in other vehicles exists in those vehicles, and this is something, again, sort of a broader attack surface that can be used. And definitely something that we see regulators in different parts of the world starting to be more and more interested in how to protect autonomous vehicles because of some of those inherent risks. And I guess, again, being aware of time, I think we can wrap it up. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything more you wanted to add from your point of view.
No, I'd just like to thank you for setting up this session and for everyone joining. It looks like a very, very interesting topic of interest for a lot of folks. So thanks so much for having me and for contributing the course to AppSec University.
Thank you very much, Dan. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
All right, and with that, I would like to bring this webinar to a close. I'd like to thank Dan and Yana for sharing their knowledge and insights with us today, and of course to Upstream for their role in making this event possible. Thanks also to our audience for all your questions and interest in today's event. As always, it's much appreciated. Now, we will be making an on-demand version of this webinar available as soon as possible too. But for now, thank you for listening from wherever you are in the world, and goodbye. Thanks again.
Thank you.